All right, today we're going to be doing lesson 1.7, which is an introduction to functions. Okay, I want you to write each of these definitions down. Okay, so for each of these definitions, the first definition we have is function. Function is a type of problem that we have, and it means for every input, there is exactly or only one output. Okay, so functions are usually written like this: y equals 2x plus 6. Okay, the y is by itself. I have an x. Okay, the input is this x value right here. It's what I input into the equation. Once I plug something in there, then I can solve that equation and I will get the output, which is y, all right? Other words for those are domain and range. The domain is the input or x. So there's three different names that I need to memorize for input. Input, domain, and x, all right? Those all three go with the word domain. Domain, input, and x, all right? So it's like somebody with a nickname. We know them as their first name, we know them as their nickname, and maybe sometimes somebody calls them their last name. All three of those names mean the same person. That's exactly what domain, input, and x are. They're always what you input into the equation. It's called our domain. The range is the output, or it's always represented by the letter y, okay? It's after what we've plugged into our problem, and it's what we're going to get out, the output, okay? So, for a function, that means whatever I plug in for x, there is only one possible answer. So let's say I were to take a problem, okay, and I have an input and output chart. Sometimes they're listed like this. So this would be our input, this would be our output. Let's say I have an input of 1. So I plug it into the problem, and I get an output of 2. So I know no matter what, when I plug in 1 into my equation, let's say it was y equals 2 times x. I plugged in 1 for x, and I got 2 for y. Anytime I plug in 1, I will never get any other answer than 2. That's how I know it's a function. Now, if I had 2 answers, okay, if I were to say for the input of 1 I got 2, and for the input of 1 I also got 5, all right, obviously it would not be able to use this equation, then this is not a function, because for the input of 1, it has 2 different outputs, okay? That would not be a function. For every input, there is only one output. That's what makes it a function. All right? So, in example 1, they want me to say, does this table represent a function? So remember, okay, you want to find out for every input, is there only one output? So that means for the input of this number, what is the output? Is that the only number that it can produce? All right, so let's find that out. Okay, so before we get started, let's name some other names for the word input. What could I also call the input? Trevor? I could call it x. What's the other name I could call input, James? Domain. Very good, okay? All right, let's do the same thing with output. What could I call output? Tyreek? Range. Very good. And what else could I call it? Kendall? Y. Very good, okay? So I know my domain, x, and input are all the same. My range, y, and output are all the same. So I need to check. For every input, is there only one output, okay? So for the input of 2, what am I going to get? 5. Is there any other outputs for that input? For the input of 2, are there any other numbers? Nope. Okay, so I'm okay. 3. For the input of 3, the output is 10. Do you see 3 at all again on this input table? Nope, so I know it only has 1. 4, I have an output of 11. Do you see 4 again in this table? Yes. Does 4 have the exact same output as it did the first time? No. So I know this is not a function. And I want you to tell me why. Why is it not a function? because for the input of 4, there were 2 outputs. That's what you would write. For the input of 4, there were 2 outputs. Okay? I want to know that you know why it's not a function, and specifically why it's not a function. Okay? So let's look at this next chart. This is the one that always confuses people. Okay? For the input of 1, what is the output? 5. How many outputs is that? 1. Okay, let's go to the next one. For the input of 2, what's its output? 5. How many outputs does it have? 1. Okay, so I'm still good. For the input of 3, what's its output? 5. How many outputs does it have? 1. Okay, for the input of 4, what's its output? 5. How many outputs is that? 1. So is this a function? Yes. Even though you say, but what? Hold on, all the outputs are 5. Doesn't matter. For the input of 1, what's the only output that input has? 5. Okay, that's one number. For the input of 2, what's the only output it has? 5. That's only one number. Okay? So as long as each of these only have one output, then it's always a function. So we can write yes, a function, and y for every input there is one output. For every input, there is one output. Okay, so in the next example, what they want me to do is they want me to make an input and output table for the equation that they have given me. And they said use 1, 2, and 3 as the domain. Okay, first of all, what is the domain? Is it input or output? Input. And if I have an equation, what letter am I plugging that input in for? X. It's always X. Okay, so this is what I want you to do. I want you to make an input-output table. Actually, I'm going to make mine smaller than that. I just like to write I and O up at the top so I don't have to write the whole thing. And I'm going to go ahead and fill in my inputs. I have 0, 1, 2, and 3. So what I need to do is I need to plug in these numbers into this equation and solve to find the output. So I start y equals 4 plus 2 times 0 because I plug in my first input. What's 2 times 0? 0. So basically I just like to cancel it out right there. And what does y equal? 4. So I plug that in as my output because y is the output, remember? Okay, let's do the next one. Y equals 4 plus 2, and this time I'm plugging in 1 as my input. 2 times 1 is 2. 4 plus 2 is 6. So I know for the input of 1, I have an output of 6. Okay? All right, let's do the next one. 2. Y equals 4 plus 2 times 2. Y equals 4 plus 4. And y equals 8. I do want you to show me all of this work. Okay, I do want you to show me all of this work. And then last but not least, y equals 4 plus 2 times 3. Y equals 4 plus 6, which equals 10. Okay? Okay, so let's make an input and output table for the next equation here. Again, I'm going to just take my input and output values, plug them into a chart. 0, 1, 2, and 3. And then I'm going to plug each of these into the equation. What am I plugging the input in for? Which letter or variable? X. Very good. So I say y equals 3 times 0. What's 3 times 0? 0. Okay? Y equals 3 times 1. What's 3 times 1? 3. Y equals 3 times 2. What's that? 6. Y equals 3 times 3, which is 9. Okay? So for the input of 0, I have an output of 0. For the input of 1, output of 3. 2, 6, 3, and 9. Are these functions? Yes, because for every input, there is only one output. Okay? What letter represents domain? X. What letter represents range? What letter represents input? X. What letter represents output? Y. What does Y represent? What two things? Range and output. What does X represent? Very good.